On today's Live Open Daily, Meta is putting the final nail in the coffin for the Quest 1, and if you're reading the tea leaves, the Quest 2 will not be far behind. I'm your host, Live Open Mike, and this is something that Meta's kind of rolled out very gradually over the course of the last 2 years. They stopped shipping like OS updates, now the security updates is kind of the last piece of it, but we've seen games dropping Quest 1 support since dating back to about 2 summers ago when Population 1 was the first major game to do it. Now, this whole process may be a bit of a foreign concept to PC gamers, and that's where VR really has its origins. It started on PC VR before it branched into standalone, and in the PC gaming world, you simply just update your current computer or maybe buy a new computer altogether. You're not really used to stuff just ending support altogether. But if you're a console gamer like I am, this is a concept that dates back over 40 years, dating back to when the original Atari started to draw support for its consoles in favor of the latest and greatest, and then we saw this roll through from Nintendo to Sega, and now with Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft, they gradually dropped support for their last generation consoles as the new ones hit the market. Like I said before, the first game to drop Quest 1 support was Population 1, that's made by Big Box, a company that Meta actually owns. Big Box put a post out on their social media and on their blog on July 26, 2022, and it reads, "We are building big Pop 1 experiences that will push the boundaries of multiplayer VR. In order to focus our efforts on next generation features and tech, we're ending Quest 1 support on October 31st, 2022. On October 31st, Quest 1 players will no longer be able to load or play Population 1. Account progress, IAP, that's in-app purchases, and crossplay are still available on supported devices, including MetaQuest 2, MetaQuest 2 with Link or AirLink, MetaQuest 1 with Link or AirLink, Oculus Rift S, and Oculus Rift. This includes purchases, skins, and everything associated with your account." And from that point forward, you started to see a bunch of teams announce that they were not going to be supporting Quest 1 moving forward. Here's a statement from Downpour Interactive, the makers of Onward. "To focus our development efforts, we will no longer support Quest 1 devices as of July 31st, 2023. The makers of Synth Riders put a post on their blog on April 19, 2023. "Today, we're sorry to announce that we'll be sunsetting Quest 1 support effective November 1st, 2023. With Meta ending Quest 1 support at firmware version 50, it's tough to develop without their platform support. Quest 1 users will still be able to play Synth Riders, but will no longer receive updates or new features for the game." And the examples go on and on and on well into 2024. Here's one from Beat Saber that was posted on May 6, 2024. "Dear players, to focus our development efforts on our next projects within Beat Saber, we will no longer support MetaQuest 1 as of November 2nd, 2024. The game will continue to be playable, but multiplayer functionality will stop and leaderboards might be phased out in the future." Coming back to Meta, back in January last year, January 31st, 2023, they put this post out on their blog. "Released in 2019, Quest 1 was a huge step forward for VR. Our first Quest device enabled developers to build even better VR experiences with deeper levels of immersion, and ultimately was a driving force pushing VR even further into the mainstream. Earlier this month, we announced important changes to Quest 1 that will begin rolling out this year. As we look to the future, we remain committed to supporting the community of Quest 1 users and developers with a few changes starting this year." And then there's a list here. What's changing on Quest 1? "We won't be shipping new features to Quest 1 started with version 50. This is what the Synth Riders devs alluded to. "We will continue to maintain the system software with critical bug fixes and security patches through August 2024. Developers and users will still be able to use Quest devices beyond 2024. They didn't put the caveat in there saying that you had to use it for PC VR. Continuing on, Quest 1 users with Meta Horizon Home social features will lose access to these features on March 5th, 2023. Quest 1 users won't be able to invite others to their home, visit someone else's home, create or join a party." And there's another list here, how this impacts developers. "Developers who wish to shut down the functionality of the Quest 1 app must provide 180 days notice to their customers. Starting in March 2023, developers will have the option to separate binaries between our devices. New Quest apps will not be admitted after January 31st, 2024. And again, that went out in January of last year, 2023. So they've been seeding this for a while. They had a very clearly marked roadmap laid out for this, and the onus became on developers to notify users of their apps that Quest 1 support was going to be ending. The most recent communication came in an email going out to all developers, so if you have a dev app on Meta, you actually got this email as well. "Notice to Quest 1 developers, as we announced last year, we are implementing important changes to Quest 1. Beginning on April 30th, 2024, we will discontinue support for new Quest 1 apps. This means new apps created after this date cannot list Quest 1 as supported hardware. You will not be able to upload builds for new apps that only support Quest 1. Builds for new apps that support other Quest devices along with Quest 1 will be able to be uploaded, but Quest 1 support will be blocked. New apps will not be listed in the category of Quest 1 in the Meta Store. Quest 1 users will not be able to search or purchase new apps created after April 30th, 2024. As a reminder, we will continue to maintain the system software with critical bug fixes and security patches through August 2024. And then Meta sent out another message to Quest 1 owners reminding them what was coming, even though we got all this communication before. Quote, "We'd like to let you know that starting August 31st, 2024, we will no longer provide bug fixes or security updates for Meta Quest 1 headsets. You will still be able to download new apps and continue using your existing apps as long as they are supported by the developer. However, if any security vulnerabilities are discovered in the future, private data that is directly stored on the device or accessible from it will be at risk of compromise." This update follows our announcement in January 2023 when we start releasing new features and new MetaQuest apps for Quest 1 on the Quest Store. We're excited about the future of MetaQuest and look forward to providing you with more groundbreaking mixed reality experiences. So as I record this podcast on July 3rd, within about 7 weeks or so, Quest 1 is essentially done. Now, Meta stopped the production of new Quest 1 headsets shortly after Quest 2 launched, and then you couldn't even buy a Quest 1 on their website at the end of 2021. By the time we were in 2022, you could not buy a Quest 1 at all. Everything was just on the secondary market. But so that's a wrap for Quest 1, but all reports are that Quest 1 really sold maybe about 1 million units or so, whereas Quest 2 was the one that was more widely adopted by most users, particularly boosted by the pandemic. This is where things get interesting though, because Quest 3 came pretty quickly after Quest 2, just about 3 years between those two headsets, and the Quest 2 is still the best-selling VR headset ever made. Now, in my opinion, this shouldn't stop Meta from discontinuing the Quest 2, and I think Meta agrees because we're getting the Quest 3S very soon. That headset's supposed to retail for around the price of a Quest 2, or at least the original price, no more than about $300. And it's being put into the market to actually replace the Quest 2 for the people who don't want to pay the upcharge for a Quest 3 that starts at $500. And beyond that, like I said at the beginning, if you've been reading the tea leaves, the Quest 2 has been on its way out for a while. There was a massive fire sale over the holidays where they discounted the Quest 2 down to $250. Shortly after, that became the official price, $249.99 if you live here in the States. And then a couple of months later, there was another price cut, cutting it all the way down to $200. Now, if you try to go in most Amazon markets and in most department stores, you'll see that the Quest 2 is actually sold out. All those displays have been changed over to the Quest 3, and you can only get it in certain Amazon markets. It doesn't seem like they're restocking that supply at all. Literally, Meta was just trying to clear out inventory. And the Quest 2 was outselling the Quest 3 something like 5-1 over this past holiday season we just went through. People were just gobbling them up because it was a cheap way to get into virtual reality, which has always been Quest 2's calling card. But even with those sales and the number of Quest 2s are out in the wild, Meta still absolutely needs to do this. Again, if you're a PC gamer, this may be a foreign concept, but if you're a console gamer, this is something that has happened all the time over the course of decades. Even with the Quest 2 sales, when the Quest 2 first hit the market, there were people already complaining that games are being dumbed down for Quest 2, which I don't necessarily disagree with. Whether you look at like Saints and Sinners 1 or the Red Matter games or the port of Robo Recall, there are countless examples of standalone graphics being severely downgraded from the PC graphics. In some cases, like in the case of Onward, you actually see changes to the PC build to accommodate cross-play on standalone headsets. When Onward from Downpour Interactive was ported to Quest 1, the PC version also saw a ton of features removed and some graphical things removed, specifically to facilitate cross-play with standalone players, something that absolutely pissed off the PC VR community. It's still dated architecture, and developers are still having to strip out a lot of like visual and graphical fidelity and things they want to put in their games specifically to fit on a standalone headset. There's a great article from Upload VR on how the developers of Into the Radius went through the whole process of porting their game, which was built for PC VR, down to standalone, and all the sacrifices and compromises they had to make for that. But at a certain point, Meta, just like any game developer, and I cringe when I call Meta a game developer, but in this context, that's what they are, they have to move on. The best-selling game console ever made is not one of the current generation. It's not the Nintendo Switch, it's not the PlayStation 5, it's not the Xbox Series S or X, even if you combine the two of those sales, is the PlayStation 2, which sold over 155 million units. The only current generation console that comes close, and I use current generation very liberally here, is the Nintendo Switch that has sold over 140 million units. It's not likely to beat PlayStation 2's record, and that's in third place behind a handheld, the Nintendo DS, which sold over 150 million units, but still did not beat the PlayStation 2. Despite PlayStation 2 having those record sales, Sony still had to move on to the PlayStation 3 and 4 and 5. And speaking to someone in their 40s, watching video games evolve from something like Pong, which my dad played, all the way up to some of the experiences we're getting today, like look at something like Baldur's Gate 3, which is just mind-blowing to look at. Hellblade 2 looks absolutely fantastic. This wasn't possible 40 years ago. VR is evolving at a rapid rate. The chip that's in the Quest 3 right now, the Snapdragon XR2 Gen 2, is already being surpassed by another chip that Qualcomm is announcing that's supposed to be in immersive visor headsets and some other headsets that are coming down the line. Quest 3 just surpassed 8 months on the market and it's already going to be dated probably by this fall when some of these new headsets hit the market. The tech is evolving so fast that it feels like a headset is dated pretty much within a year or so after it comes out, if not immediately. The Pico 4 and the Quest Pro immediately dated the Quest 2 when those hit the market in 2022, and then a year later with the release of the Quest 3, the Pico 4 was considered dated because it had the original Snapdragon XR2, and the Quest Pro, which had a modification of the XR2, is considered dated because of the new chip that's in the Quest 3, and less than a year after Quest 3 is out, we have a new chip available for that'll be in the next generation of headsets. This is moving very quickly, even though it sucks as a consumer because you feel like you have to buy a new headset every few years just to be able to keep up. Unless you're a PCVR enthusiast, but even by that standard, you may still be playing a dated architecture that may no longer be supported. Microsoft announced that they're going to be discontinuing support of their WMR headsets when Windows 10 is sunset next year. We've been waiting for Valve to release the codename Decker, the successor to the Index, for several years now. There are a lot of people who still swear by their indexes, but as they're starting to get into other PCVR only headsets, for instance like the Big Screen Beyond, they're realizing that they're missing out on the latest in optics and higher resolution and things of that nature. When Quest 3 launched, there were dozens of developers who announced that they were going to be doing Quest 3 graphical updates for their games. I have a list of every single game that has gotten a Quest 3 update so far. That list is well over 100, as developers are trying to move their games to the latest and greatest and give you the best possible visual experience. And frankly, when you look at the difference between Quest 2 and Quest 3 builds, it's really night and day. And when I put Asgard's Wrath 2 back on my Quest 2 and fired it up, I couldn't stay in the game more than 30 minutes before I realized just how bad it looked. From the Fresnel lenses to the lower resolution to the lower textures, everything just looked really blurry and sloppy. I got back in my Quest 3 as fast as humanly possible. And that's been the case for a lot of people who have upgraded to Quest 3, and you're seeing a difference in not just the pancake lenses, but the power of that new chip and what developers are able to do. Red Matter 2 is the gold standard for this. The Quest 3 version of that game looks almost identical to the PCVR version. If you really want to see a difference, check out the Saints and Sinners Chapter 1 update. Saints and Sinners Chapter 1 was originally ported to the Quest 1, and if you played it on Quest 2, even though it was slightly better resolution, you could absolutely see that with really plain, muddy textures, tons and tons of pop-in. Just wasn't a great experience if you're used to the PCVR version. The Quest 3 update, and I'll put some of that on this overlay as I talk for the people who are watching on YouTube, it's just night and day. If you look at the differences in like lighting, the number of zombies you have on screen, the texture quality, it feels like a completely different game, a lot closer, not exactly equaling, but a lot closer to what you got on PCVR. Frankly, it would be silly for Meta to just continue to support Quest 2 in perpetuity because that's one, not how tech works, and two, that's not how gaming works. At a certain point, no matter how many you sold, you have to move on to be able to push the industry forward. People have been complaining for years about quote-unquote Quest graphics and how standalone development has held VR games back. The quality of games we saw in PCVR from like 2016 up to about 2020 when standalone really exploded are night and day compared to some of the games we get now, and frankly they're not wrong, but this was still a necessary step backwards to get as many people into the ecosystem and to let developers be able to make money on their games so they can make bigger and better. A lot of VR gamers are always clamoring for these massive companies like Bethesda and the like to get into VR and start making their games into VR games, but the reality is the dollars aren't there. However, there are several developers who will ship multiple games in virtual reality, and if you look at the history of their games, each one has gotten bigger and bigger. This is how you make homegrown AAA development studios. You look at companies like nDreams, Resolution Games, Shell Games, Vertigo Games, Fast Travel, Beyond Frames, and that's just to name a few. I could go on and on with lists here and just look at the history of games that they've released. Some of their earlier games compared to the games that they're making now, they're constantly trying to do bigger and better. On top of that, you're starting to see big IPs and big franchises licensed by these developers to bring their games into VR, if not exact ports, at least games that exist in those franchises. Later this year, we're getting a Batman game set in the Arkham universe, we're getting a Metro game. It was announced recently that Resolution Games is working with Wizards of the Coast to make a Dungeons & Dragons game for VR. That game's going to be absolutely massive. And with the pending arrival of the Quest 3S, we're starting to see some leaked specs on what that headset's going to be, looking like it's going to be like a Quest 2 with the guts of the Quest 3, so like mixed reality cameras and Quest 3's chip slotted into there with Fresnel lenses and lower resolution, so like a happy medium between the Quest 2 and Quest 3. But the two important parts are full color mixed reality for all the mixed reality stuff we're getting with Quest 3 right now, and the new chipset, so all these games that are getting Quest 3 updates, like I said, I have a list of over 100, will be playable on this new headset where they're not previously playable on Quest Pro or Quest 2. Now me personally, I'm probably not picking up a Quest 3S because I already have a 512GB Quest 3, but it's definitely something I can see myself giving as a gift to like my kids or family members to get them into VR at a cheaper cost than what I paid for this headset. I said in previous videos on my YouTube channel that we're going to see Quest 3 exclusives within about a year after Quest 3's launch, and it's looking like that's coming to fruition. We've already seen that among other games, Hitman 3 VR Reloaded, Batman Arkham Shadows, and Alien Rogue Incursion will all be Quest 3 exclusive. They will not work on Quest 2 and Quest Pro. This so developers can utilize the Quest 3 to its full potential without being hampered by the lessened chipset of the Quest 2. Now, the very first Quest 2 exclusive game was Resident Evil 4 VR that released back in October 2021, but we still see NAP support Quest 1 for as long as possible, going up to 3 years later. My presumption is the same thing starts to happen with Quest 2, where games that already exist on Quest 2 will continue to get like security updates and hotfixes and things like that. Over the course of the next couple of years, we're going to see developers start to gradually wind down support for the Quest 2. At some point, Meta's going to cut off support for Quest 2. My guess is that happens next year because Quest 3S will be on the market at that point. And for as much good as Quest 2 did to the market, bringing more users into it and allowing developers to have a bigger player base to be able to make money on their apps so they can build bigger and better, we're nearing the time where Quest 2 is going to be doing more harm than good to the market. Some people would say we're at that point already, and it'll be time to put it out to pasture. That's a wrap for this episode. Quick programming note, this is the last podcast of the week. I'll be celebrating the 4th of July holiday here in the States for the rest of the weekend. I'll be back on Monday, July 8th. You can get Live Open Daily wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, YouTube, and also check out my other podcast, the XR Remix Podcast. Also check me out on Twitch. I stream VR there several days a week. I'm at Live Open Mic. Thanks, and I'll talk to you on Monday.